Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCGPLAYER affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Today's deck tech is on Urza, Lord High Artificer. He's a 1/4 human artificer that costs 2 blue. When he enters the battlefield, create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Tap an untapped artifact you control, add blue. In pay 5, shuffle your library, then exile the top card. Until the end of the turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. The power level on this commander is pushed to say the least. All of his abilities are relevant and they essentially work together. But his most powerful effect is that he allows all of your artifacts to tap for mana. And that essentially turns every single one of your artifacts into a mana rock. And on top of that, he's even a mana sink for all that mana that you can produce. So our strategy for this deck is very straightforward. We're going to get a ton of artifacts into play as quickly as possible. The more artifacts that we get into play, essentially the more mana that we have. And there are a ton of cheap artifacts out there that we can get into play quickly. So how do we actually win with this deck? Well, we're going to storm off with our artifacts to demolish our opponents. We've got plenty of ways with this deck to cast our artifacts multiple times in a turn. And by doing this, we have multiple paths to victory, which we'll go through. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how we're going to win with it. So let's start with tactic number 1. Here comes the rock. Even though Urza essentially turns all of our artifacts into mana rocks, we still want to make sure that we're running some ramp in this deck. Because an ideal scenario is to ramp on turn 2 and get Urza out as early as turn 3. So we're going to be running mana rocks like Guardian Idol, Sphere of the Suns, and Pillar of Origins. Both Guardian Idol and Sphere of the Suns enter the battlefield tapped, so that is a downside. Regardless, they can help us cast Urza by turn 3, so they're worth putting in the deck. And then when Pillar of Origins comes into play, we're going to choose Artificer, so it can help us cast Urza. And then once Urza's in play, we can use it to cast other things anyways. And then we've got Fractured Power Stone, Prismatic Lens, and Mind Stone, each of which costs 2 and enter the battlefield untapped. We can even pay 1 to tap and sacrifice Mind Stone to draw a card. Next up, we're running some low-cost mana dorks with Hedron Crawler, Mannequin, and Milliken. And finally, there's Silver Mirror, which is another mana dork, but it taps for a blue. Although these mana dorks can't tap right away on their own, if Urza's in play, they can. Again, ideally we want to ramp on turn 2 to get Urza out into play on turn 3. Once Urza's in play, every single one of our artifacts essentially becomes a mana rock. Now, generating a ton of mana is a great way to cast a ton of artifacts at once, but we've got an even more impactful way to help us out. Let's go through that way in tactic number 2, less mess. First up, we've got Ethereum Sculptor and Foundry Inspector, both of which reduce the cost of our artifact spells we cast by 1. Reducing our casting cost is an extremely powerful thing that we can do, especially in an artifact deck. Because Urza allows us to tap our artifacts for mana, essentially at a certain point, casting an artifact is actually going to net us mana. So the more of these reduction effects that we have on the field, the better. So we're also going to be running Joyrose Familiar. Not only does it reduce the cost of our artifacts, but it also does our legendaries as well as sagas. And finally, there's Mirror the Forebears, which is a very flexible card for this deck. When it comes into play, we get to choose a creature type. And then you can pay 1 to make it a copy of target creature you control of the chosen type. The most optimal play with this is to make it a copy of one of our reduction creatures, because then it can further reduce the cost of our artifacts and make it even easier to storm off. The vast majority of our artifacts have a very low converted mana cost. So if we can reduce the cost of our artifacts by 2, we can essentially cast most of them for free. And again, since each of our artifacts taps for mana, we're actually going to be gaining mana when we cast them. So we're also going to be running some ways to flood the board with artifacts so we can produce an incredible amount of mana. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 3, mass production. First up, we're going to be running Mere Battlesphere, which might cost 7, but that's easy for us to cast in this deck. It gives us a total of 5 artifact creatures on the battlefield that we can tap right away for mana. So with a net cost of 2, we're essentially getting 5 mana rocks. But we're also going to be running some cards that are essentially mana rock generators for this deck. Genesis Chamber says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. So essentially, every time we cast a creature, we get a 1/1 mana dork with it that can tap right away. And usually this would be a symmetrical effect, so our opponents can take advantage of it too, but not with this deck. Since we actually can just tap Genesis Chamber for mana, our opponents are never going to get creatures off of it. Next up, we've got another artifact that creates artifacts with Golem Foundry. Essentially, for each 3 artifacts that we cast, we get a 3/3 Golem. Again, with this deck, we can cast an absurd amount of artifacts in one turn. Since we can take those charge counters off at instant speed, we've got a few options. We can keep creating golems during our turn to generate more mana and storm off. or we can save up those counters on it to be a little more defensive in case one of our opponents is going to wipe the board. Then at the end step before our turn, we can take all those counters off and create an army of golems to take over the game. But some even more effective artifact generators are Master Thopterus and Efficient Construction. Both of these have, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. So now for every artifact that you cast, you get a second one for free. And on top of that, Sai allows you to pay 1 and a blue to sacrifice 2 artifacts to draw a card. Now these are both extremely effective cards and some of the best in the deck, but in my opinion the Golden Pig of this deck is still better. The Golden Pig is going to be our #1 card out of our 99, and the Golden Pig for this deck is Mirrodin Besieged. It's an enchantment for 2 and a blue, and as it enters the battlefield you choose Mirrodin or Phyrexian. If you chose Mirrodin, whenever you cast an artifact spell you create a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. If you chose Phyrexian at the beginning of your end step, draw a card, then discard a card. Then if there are 15 or more artifact cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses the game. This is another fantastic way to generate a ton of artifacts. It's 1 mana cheaper than Efficient Construction, so it's at the same mana cost as Sai. But unlike Sai, this is an enchantment, so it's harder for opponents to deal with. On top of that, this card gives us an alternative way to take out opponents. If someone decides to blow up all of our artifacts, we can easily kill them with this. We even have ways in this deck to bounce this back to our hand so we can choose the other mode. This is an extremely flexible and powerful card in this deck, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. Once we're set up with our generators and cost reducers though, what kind of artifacts do we want to be casting? Let's go through some now in tactic number 4, the replacements. First up, we're going to be running Conjurer's Bauble, Barb Sexton, and Terrarion. All of these are artifacts that essentially replace themselves for free. With any kind of a storm deck, we want to make sure that we don't stall out. With this deck, it's much easier for us to not stall out because we can just use Urza as a mana sink. But still, there are going to be plenty of times with this deck where it's more beneficial for us to actually draw a card rather than to put 5 mana into Urza. And then we've got Aether Spellbomb as well as Flight Spellbomb, which can essentially replace themselves for 1 mana. On top of that, we can use Aether Spellbomb to protect our commander or to bounce a threat. We even have some replacement cards that actually act as graveyard hate too. They can really come in a pinch against certain graveyard strategies. Sentinel Totem technically doesn't replace itself, but it does help us scry 1, which is still very useful. Now these 1-drops are fantastic for this deck, especially if we have a cost reducer in play. But we've got some even more effective artifacts that cost just a bit more. So let's go through them now in tactic number 5, instant results. Icor Wellspring and Prophetic Prism essentially do the exact same thing for this deck. They're artifacts that cost 2 and they draw us a card when they come into play. Now since they can tap for mana, they're essentially a 1 mana cantrip. And if we've got some cost reduction in play, their value just increases from there. They might not seem like a lot at face value, but in this deck these cards are huge. They automatically replace themselves and they can generate mana. And if we can find ways to bounce them back to our hand and cast them again, we get even more value out of them. And because of that, we'll take as many of these effects as we can get with Elsewhere Flask, Guild Globe, and Alchemist Vial. The rest of their text really doesn't matter all that much to us. All we really care about is costing 2 and drawing us a card when they come into play. Unfortunately, there's only so many budget artifacts that meet this requirement, but there are plenty of different artifacts out there that can be effective for this deck in different ways. So let's go through them now in tactic number 6, conversion rate. First up, we've got Ornithopter and Phyrexian Walker. Both are artifact creatures that cost 0. Some other artifacts that we're running that cost 0 are Herbal Poultice, Briber's Purse, and Orochi Hatchery. With our commander in play, these are essentially Mox Sapphires, which is so powerful that it's banned in commander. And Herbal Poultice can come in huge and save Urza for just 3 mana. And if we need to, we can make Orochi Hatchery create a ton of snakes. And next up, we've got some artifacts that cost 1 mana that have a little more utility. We can use Pacification Array to tap down an artifact or a creature. We can pay 3 and sacrifice Glaring Spotlight to protect our creatures. And we can pay 5 and tap and sacrifice Codex Trader to get any card back from our graveyard to our hand. This can be especially useful for us when we're storming off and we need a key piece. A good 2-drops for this deck is Golem's Heart, which can gain us a ton of life throughout the game. Not only does it gain us life whenever we cast a spell, but it gains us life whenever opponents cast spells too. And then Storage Matrix does cost 3 mana, but it's definitely worth it for that cost. As long as Storage Matrix is untapped, each player chooses artifact, creature, or land during their untapped step. That player can untap only permanents of the chosen type this step. Essentially, this gives our opponents a very tough decision each turn. It's going to slow them down pretty much no matter what they're doing. And because we can tap it whenever we want, this is going to leave us untouched. So we've talked a lot about getting set up, but what are some ways that we can have some really explosive turns? Let's go through some ways now in tactic number 7, a blue day. First up, we've got Battered Golem and Traxos Scourge of Krug. Battered Golem doesn't untap during your untap step, but whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. And then Traxos enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't untap during your untap step, but whenever you cast a historic spell, you untap it. These artifact creatures can produce an insane amount of mana in this deck. Whenever we cast an artifact spell, both of these untap. And Battered Golem is even more broken than that since it triggers any time an artifact comes into play. So if we have a token generator in play like Efficient Construction, this can get really out of hand. The amount of mana that these can produce in one turn is absolutely absurd. But we're also going to be running cards like Dramatic Reversal and Blinkmoth Infusion, which can untap all of our artifacts. With the amount of artifacts that we're going to have on the board, we can generate an absurd amount of mana with these. We can use that mana to keep storming off, or we can dump it into Urza's ability if we need to. And finally, there's Blinkmoth Urn, which says at the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, if Blinkmoth Urn is untapped, that player adds colorless for each artifact they control. With this in play, we're going to be generating a ton of mana. And on top of that, since we can tap it, our opponents don't get to take any advantage of it. But when we're storming off with all this mana and casting a ton of artifacts, we want to make sure that we're not drawing any dead cards. Let's go through some ways to prevent that in tactic number 8, top of the mind. First up, we've got Artificer's Assistant, which is going to let us scry 1 whenever we cast a historic spell. This is a fantastic way for us to get rid of any lands off the top of our library. And then Riddlesmith lets us loot whenever we cast an artifact spell, so this even lets us get rid of any dead cards from our hand. Storming off is a lot easier with either of these in play. And it's also easier for us to storm off if we get a second chance at it. So we're going to be running some extra turn spells like Karn's Temporal Sundering and Gonti's Aether Heart. Karn's Temporal Sundering can even bounce one of our artifacts back to our hand. This can actually really help us storm off in our extra turn. And then Gonti's Aether Heart is actually an artifact in itself. We have to pay 8 energy to use it though, so we need to keep that in mind. But it shouldn't be too hard for us to get 3 artifacts to enter the battlefield after it comes into play. Another card that's fantastic for this kind of a storm deck is Future Sight. It allows us to play with the top card of our library. At a certain point, if we're set up correctly, we can just keep casting everything off the top. And as long as we can keep lands off the top of our library, we can basically keep going. And finally, there's the Antiquities War, which serves a dual purpose for this deck. With its first 2 lore counters, it lets us look at the top 5 cards of our library, and we can reveal an artifact card from among them and put into our hand. Essentially, this can help us dig for the right artifact piece. And its third lore counter can win us the game. It says artifacts you control become artifact creatures with base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are multiple ways that we can win with this deck. We can storm off with some of our token generators and just win with all those tokens. But this takes it a step further by making every single one of our artifacts 5/5s. It can be very hard for our opponents to survive once that happens, but we really need some ways to protect our commander to make sure that all this can happen. So let's go on to tactic number 9, Life of a Lord. First up, there's Essence Flux, which we can use to blink Urza. Not only can we use this to protect our commander, but we can also get a construct out of it. And then we've got some artifacts that have similar effects to this with Voyager Staff and Synod Sanctum. And in this deck, at the very least, these can be mana rocks that cost 1. Next up, we've got some counter spells that counter target non-creature spell with Negate and Unwind. And Unwind is even going to give us our mana back. Finally, there's Spell Swindle, which is going to give us our mana back and then some. For this deck, it essentially reads counter target spell, create X mana rocks, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. This can generate us an absurd amount of lasting mana with this deck. But now it's time to talk about how we really storm off by getting our artifacts back. So let's go through some ways now in tactic number 10, A Stormy Day. First up, there's Rebuild, which is going to return all artifacts to the owner's hands. And then Displacement Wave is a little more flexible since we can pay X into it, and then it returns all non-land permanents with converted mana cost X or less to their owner's hands. Regardless, both of these are great ways for us to return artifacts back to our hands so that we can recast them and get more value out of them. Next up, there's Paradoxical Outcome, which is especially effective in this deck. It lets us return any number of target non-land, non-token permanents we control back to our hand, and then we draw a card for each card returned this way. Not only does this bring back the specific cards that we want, but it also lets us draw a ton of cards for it. If we're set up properly, this really lets us easily storm off. Aether Gale can even be very effective in this deck, either offensively or defensively. It lets us return any 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands, so we can pick between our artifacts and our opponent's permanents too. But finally, the most effective bounce spell that we have is actually a win condition in itself. Temporal Fissure says return target permanent to its owner's hand, and it has Storm. So once we cast it, we get to copy it for each spell cast before it this turn, and we get to choose new targets for those copies. So if we need to return our own artifacts back to our hand with this, we can. But if we've already been storming off and cast a ton of spells this turn, we can just use this to win the game. When we cast this, we can essentially just target all of our opponent's lands to bounce them back to their hands. This is a card that's very hard for opponents to stop, and it's just extremely effective at shutting down our opponents completely. This card is fantastic in pretty much any kind of an artifact storm build, and Urza is an extremely powerful artifact storm commander. But now that we've gone through the spells in this deck, let's go on to the mana base. First up, there's Alfheim Void, which taps for colorless, and when it enters the battlefield, we scry 1. And the rest of our mana base is very simple with just 33 islands. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Urza Lord High Artificer EDHREC deck is going to set you back over $1,200. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $24.88. Just a quick reminder that these deck costs actually don't include the commander because this is a commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades now to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, we're going to upgrade this deck by putting in Howling Mine and taking out Glaring Spotlight. Howling Mine is a very cheap artifact that can draw us a ton of cards throughout the game. This is usually a symmetrical effect, but since we can tap it, our opponents won't get any card advantage out of this. And then we're going to be putting in Winter Orb and taking out Pacification Array. Winter Orb can really slow down our opponents while not affecting us at all. It's only going to let them untap 1 land during their untapped steps. Again, this card can be very oppressive since Urza can break the symmetry. Next up, let's upgrade this deck by putting in Static Orb and taking out Golem's Heart. Much like Winter Orb, this can be very oppressive against our opponents and only allow them to untap 2 permanents. If our opponents can't deal with these quickly, they're going to get really far behind. And then we're going to add in Heartstone and take out Essence Flux. Heartstone basically makes it so that Urza's ability only costs 4 instead of 5. On its face, that might not seem like a huge difference, but that can save us a ton of mana throughout the game. Next up, let's add an Unwinding Clock and take out Gonti's Aether Heart. Unwinding Clock is going to untap all of our artifacts during each other player's untapped step. That's going to give us access to an absurd amount of mana on our opponent's turns. And with Urza in play, we'll always have a place to put that mana. And finally, let's add an Aetherflux Reservoir and take out the Antiquities War. Aetherflux is an incredible finisher in any artifact storm deck. It makes it very easy for us to kill all of our opponents in 1 turn right away. But now I really want to hear about your thoughts on this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.